On July 16, 1969, a rocket climbed out of Cape Canaveral and carried 3 Americans toward the moon. 500 million people watched. It was the proudest moment in the history of American science. The man who built that rocket had been a member of the Nazi Party. He had used concentration camp labor to build weapons that killed thousands of civilians in London, in Antwerp, in Paris. His name was Wernher von Braun. And the United States government knew all of this before they hired him. They didn't just tolerate his past. They buried it, rewrote it, and then put his face on the cover of Time magazine. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is declassified history, and it raises a question that no clean narrative of the space race has ever fully answered. What is a country willing to trade for 100 years of technological progress? It is the spring of 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. Allied forces are advancing from the west, Soviet forces from the east, and inside the ruins of Nazi Germany, there is something both sides want very badly. Not gold, not territory, scientists. Germany had spent the war years at the absolute frontier of rocket technology, aeronautics, and chemical engineering. The V-2 ballistic missile, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, had been built under Nazi direction and had killed approximately 9,000 people. The scientists who built it were still alive, still working, and now available. The United States government understood immediately what this meant. On May 26, 1945, weeks before the formal end of the war in Europe, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency authorized a classified program. Its original name was Operation Overcast. It was later renamed Operation Paperclip. The objective: identify, extract, and recruit the most valuable scientific minds of the Nazi regime, before the Soviets got to them first. What I find remarkable about this story, and I keep coming back to this, is that the ethical problem was not invisible to the people making the decision. They knew. They chose anyway. Let's talk about what they chose. The United States recruited approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians through Operation Paperclip. These were not peripheral figures. They were senior figures in the Nazi scientific establishment. Wernher von Braun, the most famous among them, held the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS. He was present at the underground Mittelwerk facility where V-2 rockets were assembled using forced labor from the Dora concentration camp. More than 20,000 prisoners died at Dora from exhaustion, starvation, and execution. Von Braun later claimed he had no choice, that he looked away, that the war left him no options. Historians have argued about the degree of his personal culpability for decades. What is not disputed, he was there. He knew. He was not the only one. Arthur Rudolph, one of the chief engineers of the Saturn V rocket, had been the production director at Mittelwerk. He personally supervised the use of slave labor. In 1984, when the U.S. Justice Department finally investigated him, he voluntarily renounced his American citizenship and left the country rather than face prosecution. He had lived in the United States for almost 40 years. Here is how the United States government handled this. President Truman had explicitly ordered that anyone who had been a Nazi activist or more than a nominal participant in the regime was to be excluded from the program. The military and intelligence agencies simply ignored the order. The process worked like this. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency would review a scientist's file, including records of party membership, SS rank, war crimes allegations, and then produce a sanitized version of the file. Files that documented Nazi party membership were edited or withheld entirely. In one documented case, a recruit's file was stamped, "No adverse information." The original file contained records of SS membership and direct involvement in weapons production using slave labor. The State Department, the Justice Department, and the FBI repeatedly raised concerns. They were overruled. The calculus being made, explicitly in internal memos, was this: the scientific value of these men outweighed the legal and moral complications of their past. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviets had their own German scientists. The arms race was already accelerating, and someone in Washington decided that history could wait. I've sat with this story for a while, and the thing I keep returning to is not whether the scientists were monsters or victims of circumstance. That's a real debate, and it's complicated. The thing I keep returning to is the government memos. Because the people making those decisions weren't reckless, they weren't ignorant. They were careful, deliberate men who looked at the facts and decided to look away. That choice has a name and a paper trail. Here is the other side of this story. And it is real. Wernher von Braun and his team were transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas in 1945. Then to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. They built the Redstone missile. They built Jupiter C, the rocket that carried America's first satellite into orbit in 1958. When NASA was founded that same year, von Braun became one of its most prominent figures. He designed the Saturn V. The Saturn V, the largest, most powerful rocket ever successfully flown, carried Apollo 11 to the moon. It has never failed a crewed mission. Not once. Von Braun became a celebrity in America. He appeared on television with Walt Disney. He wrote popular science articles. He gave speeches to school children about the future of space exploration. His Nazi past was not secret exactly. It was simply not discussed. A 2019 Netflix documentary, a significant body of historical scholarship, and the declassification of paperclip files have since forced a reckoning that was several decades overdue. Huntsville, Alabama, where von Braun's team was based, only removed his name from a middle school in 2021. It's worth pausing to note, the Soviets did the same thing. Operation Osoaviakim, the Soviet equivalent of paperclip, forcibly relocated somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 German scientists and their families to the Soviet Union in a single night. October 22, 1946. No recruitment process, no negotiation. They were taken. The chief architect of the Soviet space program, Sergei Korolev, worked alongside captured German engineers to develop the R-7 rocket, the same rocket that launched Sputnik in 1957 and later carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit. This does not make what the United States did more defensible. What it does is complicate the triumphant narrative of the space race as a contest between freedom and totalitarianism. Both sides reached into the ruins of the same regime. Both sides extracted what they needed. Both sides preferred to say as little about it as possible. The moon landing was real. The moral compromise that made it possible was also real. These two facts have never been fully reconciled. A few things I came across in the research that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. First, the name paperclip did not come from strategy or symbolism. It came from paperclips. Agents literally used paperclips to attach the scientists' photographs to their recruitment folders. The mundane logistics of one of the most morally fraught programs in American history were organized with office supplies. Second, von Braun surrendered to American forces by riding a bicycle toward Allied lines with his SS insignia still on his uniform. He reportedly said in English, "We were defeated," as if the war had happened to him. Third, at least one of the scientists recruited under paperclip had conducted medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. He was brought to the United States, given a new identity, worked for the US military for years. When investigators eventually identified him, he was deported. He was never prosecuted. And fourth, when the Smithsonian proposed a 1994 exhibit that would have placed the atomic bomb and its human casualties in honest historical context, the backlash was so intense that the exhibit was canceled and the museum director resigned. America has always had a complicated relationship with looking directly at itself. I want to be clear about something before we end. This is not a story about whether the moon landing was worth it. It was. This is not a story about whether science can be separated from the circumstances that produced it. It cannot. This is a story about what happens when a nation decides that the future is more important than accountability. When the strategic urgency of now becomes the reason to defer the reckoning of then. Operation Paperclip ended officially in 1990. The last of its recruits had died or retired. The files were declassified. The story came out, slowly, partially, the way these things always do. What no declassification can answer is the question underneath the question. If the United States had refused, if it had said, "We will not do this," regardless of what the Soviets do, regardless of what we lose, what would have been different? Would the space race have been won? Would it have been won later? Would it have mattered? We don't know. We know what was chosen. We know what it cost. And we know that the men who built the rocket that carried Armstrong to the moon are buried in American soil. Some celebrated, some forgotten. Some who should have faced a very different kind of justice. History is not a clean story. The Neptune Vault doesn't tell clean stories. If that's what you're looking for, subscribe.